Liam, welcome to the Bell Tale.
Thank you.
Liam, we didn't have a podcast on Monday, so before we get into Tuesday's evidence, could we very quickly have a quick look at what happened on Monday?
Mm-hmm. We'll run back through. There were two witnesses. One was a police officer, one was a person who was in the Northwood Road area. I suppose the officer, that's Constable Wilson, he was on duty the day after Noah's disappearance. That's the Monday. He gave evidence relating to the Northwood Road area in which the boy was last seen alive. And in his statement, he said he was tasked to the area around 8 p.m. on Monday evening. That was following a report a resident had found a mountain bike matching the description of Noah's. We know that resident to be Karen Crooks, who we've heard from before. I observed the bike had been picked up by the homeowner, is what Constable Wilson said after discovering it on the ground. He said he also observed Noah's hoodie and trainers, placed them into an evidence bag, did the same thing with his skateboard helmet, which was discovered on the road. He said all that evidence had been handed to the sergeant on duty. He said he hadn't seen any other clothing and hadn't viewed any CCTV images while he was in the area. He then faced questions from Brenda Campbell, KC, counsel for Fiona Donohoe. She asked if the clothes were sealed in a forensically secure manner, to which Mr. Wilson replied no. At the time, he said he was dealing with a missing person and he was unaware of the level it was at, so I suppose the level of risk. If the items had been soaked or covered in blood or there was damage, that would have changed the circumstances. He confirmed he hadn't sealed them in the evidence bags, and when he was asked why, he said that his colleague had suggested a police dog, what he said was a police call sign, could have been called in future to maybe sniff the clothing and assist with the search in that manner. So he confirmed Ms. Campbell's suggestion. He had not located the precise location of the items. He hadn't noted that. And he said they'd been placed in separate bags, placed in a bit of a patrol car before being handed to a sergeant later on.
And there was also a witness, a Mr. McConnell, we heard from yesterday also.
There was indeed. Mr. McConnell, his mum, Kerry Fraser, she'd already given evidence to the inquest earlier on, and she had mentioned that her son had been with her and he was in the front room with her when they saw Noah cycle past naked. He said in his evidence he had seen a small dark car. He'd given a statement heading to the cul-de-sac on Northwood Road soon after he and his mum saw Noah cycling. The inquest has heard previous evidence confirming the identity of those in the car, and those are visitors to a resident in the cul-de-sac. They were simply dropping off some flowers, so that loose end has been tied up, so to speak. Mr. McConnell, he told the inquest he believed he had made 3 calls to police and not 2, as he said in a statement in March 2022. And there was a very terse back and forth between him and the PSNI counsel, Mr. Donohoe, KC, where they tried to ascertain whether he could have been mistaken about his call on June 21st. He said no, he couldn't. He was then asked could he check his phone records to maybe confirm that, and he said that wasn't his job. That was a job for the PSNI. Ultimately, at the end of his evidence, Mr. Justice Rooney asked him if he could scroll back to see if he could find a social media post he mentioned in his evidence, and as well if he could go back through, or if he would allow the police to go through his phone records to check if he had made that call on June 22nd, and ultimately he agreed. He wrote down the name of the person who shared the social media post he referred to, and that was handed to the coroner on Monday.
Now, today, Tuesday, we've seen many headlines in the evidence given today. For the most part, the evidence is also, by coincidence, related to the Tuesday following Noah's disappearance on the Sunday. So we are 2 days in, I suppose. Now, we heard from a Mr. Minari, who at the time was attached, he was a police officer who was attached to the tactical support group of the PSNI and who was involved in the hazardous environment search team. So he had 2 jobs in the PSNI. And one of the things he said that by the Tuesday, hundreds of people, hundreds of local residents had gathered around the scene of the search in an agitated state.
Mm-hmm. He was then an inspector. To put him in context, he was asked about his experience and his training. He had some decades of experience. He's retired now at this point, but he was at the point where Noah went missing. He was an inspector. He provided 3 statements. The first was dated June 9th, 2021. So, coming up to a year after Noah was disappeared and was subsequently found dead. He said he became aware of the missing persons case on June 23rd. So that's 2 days after Noah disappeared. Initially 2 officers, he said, were deployed to assess the likelihood that Noah had entered the storm drain. So they were at the park, the Northwood Linear Park, on June 23rd to carry out almost, I suppose, preparatory searches or initial searches of the area. Did he indicate why they would have begun that course of action? What arose their suspicions? I suppose they were tasked. He was contacted and asked could they provide assistance to the search, and at that point those 2 officers became available. they were tasked to the Northwood Linear Park area, and they carried out initial searches to see, I suppose, assess the likelihood of whether he had gone into the drain, and that would inform then future searches in the days to come. It was then the following day, June 24th, that Mr. Minari and other officers were in attendance at Northwood Linear Park. It was reported to him. He said there were hundreds of residents in quite an agitated state.
So that was the Wednesday.
This would have been the Wednesday, June 24th.
Okay, just to be clear about that.
Yep, just to put it in context there. The inquest heard it took more than an hour to clear the park to allow the HES team to start work. And it was during that point where they were clearing the park of those people, they said a lock was cut off a gate to allow the team access to an entrance to the storm drain culvert. He said it had been covered with a grill and the access hatch, and that could be lifted to access the culvert. That hatch wasn't secure. Now we'll hear a bit more about the cutting off of the lock later in evidence, but at this point that's where our evidence is. During the camera search, an obstruction was noted that the camera was unable to get past. That's understood to be a manhole cover that had been down in the culvert. At that point then, Mr. Minari, he entered the tunnel himself. That was around 10 to 5 and made his way along the culvert. He said nothing of evidential value was noted, and he withdrew from the tunnel at 5:20 p.m.
So the police inspector himself entered the tunnel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And he described the inside of this tunnel.
Not only did he describe it, the inquest actually saw footage of inside the tunnel.
So how big is this tunnel?
This tunnel, 900 mils was the description he used. Now, it's big enough, he said, for someone to walk across it if they were crouched down. So that kind of gives you a bit of context. As you go further down the culvert, it becomes slightly smaller, down around where the Seaview Stadium is. It shrinks to 750, and that's, becomes a bit smaller. But what he said was you would be able to walk in a crouched position. But he also said without artificial light, it would be pitch black in the tunnel. You wouldn't be able to see in front of your face. The camera had the advantage of having LED lights on it, and they did show footage of the camera, the footage that the camera had captured from inside the culvert. You can see the artificial light lighting up the water as it flows through. There's a little small, maybe a couple of inches of water. You can see it flowing downwards down the culvert, and you can see the inside of the pipe as that camera moves along. Shortly into the footage there, a chain comes into view. There's a kind of chain draped across the culvert, and Mr. Minari mentioned that would kind of be normal. You would find those from time to time through the culvert. So it gave the jury, I think, a sense of what it would have been like inside that culvert, albeit with some artificial light at that point.
And he said there's a couple of things he said around his search of the tunnel. He said he confirmed that insofar as he searched the tunnel, that it was clear and that there was no sign of Noah having been in the tunnel. He also said that by June the 25th, the search had gotten almost to the point where Noah was found, but that it had to cease due to the rising tide. He also said he was not personally involved in the search on June 26 to 27, as he was not on duty. There's a number of things in his description of the tunnel.
Yeah, we know from previous evidence, Noah was found near the Northern Ireland Railways yard, which is further on down from the section described here. To give some context, and the jury was shown a map of the tunnel. So the tunnel goes from Northwood Linear Park, where the culvert entrance is. It goes right down under the Shore Road. Then it reaches the point where there's the gates of Seaview Stadium. So if anyone knows Seaview Stadium on the Shore Road, that's the point we're at now. There's then a kind of a right-angled chicane where it turns first right down parallel with the Shore Road and then left, and that left then takes you up underneath the sideline of Seaview, heading down towards where it ultimately comes out underneath the railway yard and then out into Belfast Loch. So that gives you some idea of the geography of the tunnel. Where that right angled, he was asked questions about that right angled section, whether something or someone could become maybe stuck in that if they were being carried by the water. He said it was possible. He said, Mr. Minari, he said that he went as far as he could along the sideline of Seaview, and he could see the water there was maybe 5 or 6 inches deep. At that point, he could confirm the tunnel was clear, and there was no sign of Noah having been in the tunnel, so he wasn't there. There was no evidence of him being there at that point.
He said, with the benefit of lighting, I was able to look ahead. The water and silt was not of a sufficient depth to cover a human of Noah's age. I was able to satisfy myself that Noah was not in it. Beyond hatch 8, the tunnel dropped rapidly and was affected by the tide, clearly making survival in that section impossible. We know Noah was not in the non-tidal section. Is he saying that Noah was in the tidal section?
He's not saying that explicitly. What he's saying is that there was no evidence that he could find that Noah was in that non-tidal section during that element of the search. I suppose he's not saying definitively there that he is in the tidal section, but he is noting that if you go further on down, it dips significantly and it goes into that section where the tidal water comes into. And the jury was showing diagrams really of a kind of cross section of the tunnel where it showed the blue, dictating where the water went up to. And the water, they said, would go up as far as the Shore Road, so it would go entirely underneath Seaview right up to the Shore Road section. That doesn't mean that was all totally submerged in water. What he said was that underneath Seaview and leading up to the Shore Road would maybe be half full at full tide. So that gives you an idea of the kind of the water. But further on down towards Belfast Lough, that would be completely submerged in water.
He did say something else now, that the environment in which he found himself in, the conditions in the tunnel, and he stressed at all times that his team, this is not a dive team here. This is to quote the exact thing,
hazardous environment search team,
that they had to remain compliant with the confined space regulations. But he did say that the tunnel contained multiple items that could cause injury, and he also said that it's a difficult thing to hear, that the tunnel itself would have been a very challenging place to survive if you were naked.
Mm-hmm. Just on those confined space regulations, they relate to legislation from 1999. The legislation, Mr. Minari said, was in place to protect, obviously, the people carrying out the search and also members of the public who would be in and around that area. He said it was a very challenging environment, as you mentioned there. He stressed his team had to remain compliant, and that's part of the reason. The tunnel contained multiple items that could cause injury. There were stones, debris, drops, pipes that were entering the tunnel. He also mentioned branches later on. There was the silt, which kind of built up with a number of different materials. That was kind of toxic. He said, sometimes dead animals became embroiled in that silt and they could release chemicals and gases, so that created extra hazards. As well as that, you had the cold. He said it was very cold even in June. I mean, you're well underground here. There's no light, no sunlight coming in, and there's a constant flow of cold water coming both from the inlet and then when the tide turns, obviously from Belfast Lough itself. He said that he believed it would be a very challenging place to survive if you were naked, and we know that prior to being in this tunnel, Noah was naked. He also mentioned about sound travelling some distance in the tunnel. So he later described it as a kind of cacophony of sound. He said it travelled some distance. They went in and they shouted to see, just in case Noah was alive. Whilst crawling, we also shouted Noah's name and police, and at no point did we receive a response or hear noises that may have been Noah. Mr. Minari also noticed that the storm drain was not a sewer, and he said there was no food source that would have given rise to rats, and he confirmed he didn't encounter any rats while he was in the culvert itself. Mr. Minari pointed out that the storm drain had only ever been identified as a place where Noah might be, and other places were also being searched, including Linear Park and Cave Hill Park at that point. The search was looking for Noah on the evidence that he may have been in the tunnel at some point.
He said it wasn't a rescue operation where it was believed he was in the tunnel. Had it been a rescue operation, he said, the fire service would have been tasked. And he also said there was complete tidal submergence twice a day, which inhibited searches and the chances of survival. Did he indicate where those tidal surges ended?
That's the reference point we mentioned earlier, where the tide comes right up to the Shore Road. It's not complete tidal submergence right up to that point. The complete tidal submergence is further down towards Belfast Lough. The depth that he gave at that point was that the tunnel would have been half full at that stage, so you still would have been able to stand up in it.
He also discussed the crowd. A crowd had gathered. There was a lot of public interest. A crowd had gathered with some, and I stress some, people in that crowd behaving in a hostile fashion, to quote Mr. Minari.
Mm-hmm. He told the jury there were around 300 to 400 people in the park on the day that the full search team turned up with the equipment to carry out that. He said they were mostly well-meaning, but there were some behaving in a hostile fashion. He said it was simply not possible to engage in the search before clearing the park.
He was also asked why only 2 officers were initially sent to the park.
Yeah, those officers, that was on 23rd of June. They had been engaged in other work elsewhere, and it was only whenever they were freed up from that other work that they were dispatched to the park then to carry out those initial kind of searches to see what the likelihood was of Noah entering the storm drain at that point.
And he also said he had no access to any maps of the culvert system, so it was, in a sense, he entered without really knowing where he was going.
At that point, they didn't have any maps. They asked the FI for, when I say maps, it would have been a map as we would know it. What he said he called them schematics, which is a mapping out of all the different pipes and things in that area. So you imagine you're in an area behind a house, there's going to be utility pipes there's going to be sewer drainage pipes, and again, you've got the pipes that are connected, directly to the culvert system. They had to ascertain where the pipes were that led to the culvert system, and in order to do that, they needed those schematics or maps from DFI, which were ultimately provided and did give them a focus for their search.
We mentioned earlier that the conditions inside this tunnel were completely black. He said that no light enters whatsoever, and he also said that the flow of water in this tunnel would not have carried anybody.
No, he said it was very low water in the tunnel, 5 to 6 inches at that point down where the sea view ground was. Yeah, he said it was a large enough area for people to walk crouched down. But again, as you say, it would have been pitch black at that point. It would have been very hard. He mentioned later in his evidence that if it was him doing it in the pitch black, he would have had to crawl on all fours with his hand out in front of him in order to, before he encountered any obstacles or obstructions in the pipe.
He also outlined some of the risks involved. He was, again in a cross-examination from another barrister, he reiterated the risks involved.
Yeah, that was a question from Declan Quinn, junior counsel for the coroner. He was asked about the risks associated with the search operation and this document they've had to fill out called a safe system of work document, basically a risk assessment. And he said that document was a living document that was updated as the search went on. He was again asked about risks that were posed by gas, and he said every time you lift a manhole, you have to gas detect. So you have to detect it at the top, the middle as you're going in, and then down at the bottom. And that's before you can physically enter the tunnel. I suppose that's to keep the people who are doing the search safe, as well as risks from the tide and the gas. Mr. Minari said risks were also posed by things like slips, trips, falls, glass, rocks, and boulders, if you can get an idea of the kind of debris that may be inside, and as well as rotten animals, taking up part of the silt, which he mentioned earlier. And again, the obvious risk as well from the cold, which he said was a big factor there. You're looking at the likes of hyper and hypothermia, and the effects they would have on anyone down in that tunnel.
The cross-examination did return to the issue of the crowds, and reference was made to rumours in the crowds, between the crowds, being rife. It was described as a febrile atmosphere as hundreds of people gathered in the park. Yeah,
as we said earlier, Mr. Minari estimated around 300 to 400 people, and that was an estimate also carried by a sergeant who was on the ground in the park. Those details were recorded in a police log, which recorded details of the attempt to search. And it noted when they arrived, there were hundreds of people. They all appeared to have been called out to help by local political representatives on local radio and social media. He said at that point, political reps had since left, and there was no guidance for the public who were at that point wandering around Linear Park and the Shore Road. He was asked then by Mr. Quinn if he was aware of the social media calls, and he said there were all sorts of rumours on social media, speculation, rumour. And he said that again, there were hundreds of people in that park. He said there were rumours that Noah had been abducted, there were paramilitaries, paedophiles, all sorts of nefarious people, and also rumours that the police had been involved. He described it as the rumours between those crowds as being rife. Mr. Quinn then suggested to Mr. Minari that there may have been a febrile atmosphere, and he said there was. A lot of people were getting frustrated. There was a lot of anti-police feeling among a portion. He talked about people milling around the park, shouting. Some wanted to search. When the police vehicles came on site, he said people were hanging around the back of them, looking in and trying to reach into the vans. And often officers being accused of, the words he used were, you knew what was going on, you have Noah, this kind of thing. So he talked a little bit about that in the crowd, and then he mentioned the attempt to clear the crowd. So he had gone down to, police had obviously arrived at the park, realised they weren't going to be able to search there due to the crowd, but rather than sit around and wait, they decided to go down to the Shore Road section, lift a manhole there, and try and look in and see what they could see, maybe work their way back up towards the culvert. At that point then Mr. Minari arrived, realised the situation and said, look, we have to get this park cleared. They went back up to the park, and another sergeant who was on duty at the time, he said he had gone in, heard a bit of a commotion, identified himself as a police officer, asked the public to move back. He said members of the public were arguing with local residents at that point. He noted that it was eventually cleared around 1 p.m, 1:15 p.m, and it was shortly after a member of the public had cut off the lock to the storm drain entrance with an angle grinder. Mr. Minari said there was a metal gated system which led to bushes, and behind that was the entrance to the culvert. It was at that point the sergeant had heard people shouting. Someone had got an angle grinder and cut the lock off, and it was cut at one by a member of the public. And at that point, he said local reps, along with local police, were able to clear the park, and that allowed them to continue with their search.
So it was a member of the public cut off the lock to the culvert, not the PSNI.
Yep, that's what Mr. Minari told the jury today.
And he also then, under cross-examination, give some more details of his physical search, his own physical search. He entered it himself, as we've said already. He said he could actually get through quite easy. He searched around there. He said there are other tunnels that are not part of the culvert system but coming into it. He had lights in his helmet. He was on his hands and knees.
Mm-hmm. Well, he mentioned he was on his hands and knees trying to clear debris so that he could move up and down. Now, remember, he's got a light in his head. He said he was asked how Noah would have gotten past any obstruction that was there. And he said he could have walked over the stoop or crawled through. But he did mention the fact that there was zero light, there was zero visibility. And to walk in a stoop way would have been quite difficult. And again, he said if it was him, he would have been on all fours with his hand out in front of him as if to, feel any obstruction before he gets to it and see how to deal with it. And again, he mentioned that cacophony of sound. He said the sound carried considerably well. He said he shouted. Again, as we heard earlier, he asked them for complete silence so he could try and hear a response. And the words he used were, at no point was there any other sound. He was then asked if he had heard any noise, and he said absolutely.
He was asked if he was confident that there was no depth in the tunnel that would have hidden a body. Now, clearly, further down in the when it's tidal, he would not have been aware of that. But that referred to, I take it, in terms of the section that he had searched.
Mm-hmm. This is the section he searched. This was the stretch that runs along underneath the sideline at Seaview, the Seaview football ground. He said that he mentioned the tide and said it comes in twice a day from Belfast Loch. And at the very end of the culvert where it runs out to Belfast Loch, it would start to gather and rise up through. It rushes in the culvert then. He indicated that further up the culvert, close to the two right angles, it would be at half full. Now, the right angles are just before you get to Seaview, just at the gate. So at that point, that's where it would have been half full. And then as you obviously went down further towards Belfast Loch at high tide, that would have then increased. He said the football ground's about 5 or 6 metres above the foreshore. There's then a significant drop, which is why the water becomes deeper at that point. But at that point before the drop, he said it was around 5 to 6 inches deep, still flowing where he was down. He said he could see bricks, boulders, bits of branches there. And he said with a good degree of certainty, there was no depth that would have hidden a body. Mr. Minari said by the end of the football pitch, it would have become very tidal. And a decision was made at that point to suspend the search. He was asked by Mr. Quinn if he felt it would have been safe to continue the search beyond the football ground section, and he said no.
And that ended today's evidence.
Yeah, we had one witness. That witness will be back tomorrow, where he, will face questions from the other counsel, Donal Lunny, the PSNI, Brenda Campbell, on behalf of Noah Donohoe. So he will come back for a second day's evidence tomorrow.
Liam Tunney, thank you very much.
Thank you.